You've been doing everything right. You've been patient. You've been loving. You've been showing up every single day, and they still feel distant, still feel cold, still feel like no matter what you do, it's never quite enough. And here's the part that's going to hit you hard. It's not because you're not good enough, it's because you've been giving them the wrong thing entirely. There is one thing avoidants actually crave. One thing. And almost nobody talks about it. And once you understand what it is, everything you thought you knew about love, about connection, about how to get closer to someone who keeps pulling away, it's going to completely shift. So if you've ever loved someone who seemed to shut down when you got too close, who disappeared when things got real, who said they cared but their actions made you feel invisible, stay with me. Because what I'm about to share with you is going to change the way you see them, and more importantly, the way you see yourself in this dynamic. Before we go any further, I need you to do one thing. Drop the word avoidant in the comments right now, just that one word. It's going to tell me you're watching, it's going to tell me you're serious about understanding this, and it helps this video reach more people who are quietly suffering through exactly what you're going through. And make sure you're subscribed, because what comes after this is even more important than what I'm about to say. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand what avoidants actually crave, you first need to understand what they're afraid of. And most people get this completely wrong. Most people think avoidants are afraid of love. That's not it. They're not afraid of love. They're afraid of what love costs them. They're afraid of what loving someone requires them to do. It requires them to be seen, to be known, to be vulnerable. And for someone with an avoidant attachment style, vulnerability isn't just uncomfortable. It's terrifying, not because they're weak, but because somewhere along the way, being vulnerable got them hurt. Being open, being soft, being real with someone, it didn't end well for them. Maybe it was a parent who dismissed their feelings. Maybe it was a relationship where they gave everything and got abandoned anyway. Maybe it was something more subtle, a childhood where emotions weren't safe, where expressing a need was met with silence or criticism or punishment. Whatever it was, their nervous system learned something very early on. It learned that needing people is dangerous. And so it built a wall, not to keep love out, but to keep pain out. The tragedy is that the wall keeps both. Now here's where most people in a relationship with an avoidant make their first big mistake. They try to tear the wall down. They get closer. They call more. They text more. They do more. They give more. They try harder. They think if they just love them enough, the wall will come down. But what actually happens is the opposite. The more you push toward an avoidant, the more they retreat. The more you reach for them, the more they pull away. And you start to feel crazy. You start to wonder what's wrong with you. Why isn't this working? Why can't they just let me in? And I want you to hear me on this. There is nothing wrong with you. You were doing what every loving person does. You were responding to disconnection by trying to reconnect. That's natural. That's human. The problem is that with an avoidant, that approach triggers the exact mechanism you're trying to calm down. Think of it this way. Imagine someone who is deeply claustrophobic. They're trapped in a small room. You love them. You want to help. So you walk into the room to comfort them. But the moment you walk in, the room gets smaller. Your presence, as well-intentioned as it is making the thing they fear worse. That's what it feels like to an avoidant when someone pursues them too hard. It's not that they don't want love. They do. Desperately. But the way you're delivering it is activating their deepest fear. The fear of being trapped, the fear of losing themselves, the fear of being consumed by someone else's need for closeness. So let's talk about what they actually crave, because this is where it gets really interesting. And this is the part most people miss completely. Avoidants don't crave more love in the traditional sense. They don't crave more gestures, more effort, more proof of how much you care. All of that stuff, as meaningful as it is to you, lands differently for them. What an avoidant craves more than anything else in this world is safety. Not the safety of a warm hug, not the safety of someone saying I love you. Emotional safety. Specifically, the safety of knowing that being with you will not cost them who they are. Let me say that again because it matters. They need to know that loving you will not require them to disappear into you. That they can be close to you without losing their sense of self, that they can need you without becoming dependent on you, that they can be vulnerable with you without being punished for it. That's what they crave. Safety. real, deep, non-negotiable emotional safety. And the moment you understand that, everything changes because now you stop asking the question, how do I get them to open up? And you start asking the question, how do I become someone they feel safe opening up to? And that is a completely different question, a completely different approach, and it leads to completely different results. So let's break down exactly how to create that kind of safety. Because it's not what most people think it is. It's not about being endlessly patient. It's not about shrinking yourself. It's not about walking on eggshells. It's actually the opposite of most of those things. The first thing you need to understand is that avoidants feel safest around people who don't need them to be different. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive because you're probably thinking, but I want them to change. I want them to be more open, more present, more emotionally available. And those are fair things to want. But there's a difference between wanting growth in a relationship and communicating that the person you're with is fundamentally not enough as they are right now. Avoidants are hyper-attuned to judgment. They've spent years bracing for it. And when they feel like they're being evaluated, when they feel like they're constantly falling short, when they feel like who they are right now isn't acceptable, they shut down completely. Not because they're stubborn, but because that feeling, the feeling of not being enough, is exactly the wound that created their avoidance in the first place. You reopening that wound, even accidentally, even with the best intentions, pushes them right back into survival mode. So the first step to creating safety is acceptance, not passive acceptance, not acceptance that excuses bad behavior, but genuine, grounded acceptance of who they are right now, including the fact that they find vulnerability hard, including the fact that they need more space than most people, including the fact that they show love differently than you do. When an avoidant feels accepted as they are, not fixed, not improved, not worked on, but accepted, something starts to shift. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, they start to lower the wall, because the wall was built to protect against rejection. And when rejection stops coming, it doesn't need to be as high. Now here's the second thing, and this one is critical. You have to maintain your own life, your own interests, your own friendships, your own goals, your own sense of who you are completely independent of them. And I'm not saying this as a manipulation tactic. I'm saying this because it's what creates real safety for an avoidant. Because when you are a whole person with a full life, when you are not entirely dependent on them for your happiness, when you don't fall apart every time they need a little space, you stop being a threat to their independence. You stop being the thing they need to protect themselves from. You become someone they can actually relax around. Because they know that being with you doesn't mean being consumed by you. They know that you have your own world, your own richness, your own fullness, and that they can enter that world and also leave it without it destroying you. This is actually incredibly attractive to an avoidant. Because the thing they fear most, which is someone who needs so much from them that they feel responsible for that person's entire emotional state, that thing is absent when you're a complete self-sufficient person. You become safe, not because you've given them everything they ask for, but because you've shown them that being with you doesn't come at the cost of their freedom. Now, I want to pause here for a second, because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, so I just have to pretend not to care. I just have to act like I don't need them. I just have to be cool and distant and detached. No, absolutely not. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not telling you to play games. I'm not telling you to suppress your genuine feelings. I'm not telling you to become emotionally unavailable yourself. What I'm telling you is something much more powerful than that. I'm telling you to build a life so rich, so full, so genuinely yours, that your emotional well-being is not entirely dependent on what this one person does or doesn't do on any given day. That's not detachment, that's self-respect. And there is a massive difference between the two. Because here's the truth, when you're anxious in a relationship, when you're constantly monitoring them, constantly checking the temperature of the connection, constantly wondering what they're thinking, feeling, whether they're pulling away, whether they still care, that anxiety doesn't just hurt you, it transmits. Avoidants feel it. And that anxiety, that desperate need for reassurance, is one of the most activating things for their nervous system. It says to them, this person needs something from me that I don't know how to give. And instead of leaning in, they pull back. not because they're cruel, but because they genuinely don't know how to meet that need. And the pressure of feeling like they should is suffocating to them. So when you build a full life, when you genuinely enjoy your days with or without them, when you stop making them the center of your emotional universe, you remove that pressure, and something really interesting starts to happen. They start to move toward you, because now there's space to move into. Because now getting closer to you doesn't feel like getting trapped. It feels like a choice. And avoidants need to feel like connection is a choice they make, not an obligation they can't escape. Let's talk about communication now, because this is where so many people go wrong with avoidance. The instinct when someone is pulling away is to talk about it, to bring it up, to process it, to ask questions. Are you okay? Are we okay? What's going on? Why have you been distant? And I understand why you do it. You need answers. You need clarity. You need to feel the connection being restored. But for an avoidant, that conversation, especially if it happens when they're already in their shell, feels like an interrogation. It feels like pressure. It feels like being pulled into a place they're not ready to go. And so they shut down even more, or they give you a surface level answer just to make the pressure stop. And neither of those things actually helps you. What works better is learning to create low-pressure moments of connection. Instead of sitting someone down and saying we need to talk, which to an avoidant sounds like a 5-alarm fire, you create contexts where talking happens naturally, where sharing happens because the environment is relaxed, not because there's an agenda on the table. This is why avoidants often open up more during activities than during conversations, because when you're doing something together, walking, cooking, watching something, driving somewhere, the pressure of eye contact and direct emotional discussion is removed. And in that lower pressure environment, they can actually start to talk, start to share, start to be a little more present. Not because you forced it, but because the conditions finally felt safe enough. And when they do share, when they do let something real slip through, this is the most important moment. How you respond in that moment determines whether the wall comes up higher or starts to come down. If they share something vulnerable and you react with too much emotion, too much intensity, too much urgency, they're going to feel like they made a mistake by sharing. Like opening up led to exactly the overwhelming response they were afraid of. So when they share, you match their energy. You stay calm. You reflect what they said. You thank them for telling you. And then you let it breathe. You don't push for more. You don't try to solve it immediately. You don't make it bigger than it is. You just receive it quietly, gratefully, and let them feel what it's like to be heard without being overwhelmed. That moment, that experience of being heard without the ceiling caving in, is incredibly powerful for an avoidant because it goes against everything their nervous system predicted. They expected that opening up would lead to chaos, to demands, to intensity, and instead it led to peace. And the nervous system files that away. It starts to build a new association. Opening up with this person is safe. And every time you create that experience, the wall comes down a little more. Now, I want to talk about something that most people in relationships with avoidance don't want to hear, but it's the most important thing I'm going to say in this entire video. You cannot pour yourself into someone who is consistently unavailable and expect that to work. I know you love them. I know you see their potential. I know there are moments of real connection that remind you why you're here, but love is not enough on its own. Love needs to be accompanied by growth, by effort, by a willingness to move towards someone even when it's scary. And if the person you're with is not doing any of that work, if they're permanently sealed off, if every conversation about the relationship ends in shutdown or deflection, if there has been zero movement despite your best efforts, then the question you need to ask is not how do I love them better? The question you need to ask is whether this relationship is capable of giving you what you need. Because here's what I know to be absolutely true. You deserve someone who is trying, not someone who is perfect, not someone who is fully healed, not someone who never has hard days or closes off sometimes, but someone who is genuinely, consistently trying to be better, trying to meet you, trying to grow. And if that effort is completely absent, if you've been the only one stretching, the only one growing, the only one trying, then staying in that dynamic isn't love. It's a sacrifice that has no end and no reward. But here's the flip side, and I want to be fair because some of you are in situations where your avoidant partner is trying, where they do care, where you can see them making small movements toward you even when it's hard for them. And you keep pulling away from that because you're so activated by the moments they retreat that you can't appreciate the moments they reach. And that's worth examining too. Because if you're so conditioned to expect abandonment that you can't recognize genuine effort, that's not their avoidance anymore. That's yours. And it's worth being honest about that. This is actually one of the most painful and fascinating dynamics in relationships. When an avoidant and an anxiously attached person come together, which happens more than you would think. You get this push-pull cycle that feels absolutely exhausting. The anxious person reaches, the avoidant retreats, the anxious person reaches harder, and they spin around each other in this dance that feels like love but is actually just each person's wounds bumping against the others. And neither person is the villain in that story. Both people are in pain. Both people are doing the best they can with the emotional tools they were given. But without awareness, without intention, without both people deciding to do something differently, that cycle just keeps going until someone finally breaks. So how do you break it? If you're the anxious person in this dynamic, the work is not to suppress your need for closeness. The work is to develop your ability to tolerate uncertainty without immediately reacting to it. To be able to sit with the discomfort of temporary distance without interpreting it as permanent abandonment. Because for an avoidant who is genuinely trying, the space they take is not a rejection. It's a necessary part of how they regulate themselves. And if you can learn to receive that space without panic, without punishment, without a flurry of messages trying to pull them back, if you can let them have the space and trust that they'll come back, you create the environment in which they actually can come back. Because here's what happens when you panic during an avoidance retreat. When you flood them with messages, when you show up demanding to know what's wrong, when you make their need for space into a crisis, they don't feel loved, they feel hunted. And the thing they needed in order to return, which was just a little bit of room to breathe, is taken away. And so they go further, and you get more panicked, and the cycle continues. But when you can hold steady, when you can send one message and then genuinely go about your life and wait, when you can demonstrate through your behavior that their space doesn't destroy you, something shifts. They start to trust that coming back won't lead to an avalanche of unmet emotional need waiting on the other side. And that trust is what makes it possible for them to actually come back. Let me give you a completely different way of thinking about all of this. Think about the difference between a house with all the windows and doors locked and a house with the doors gently open. An avoidant is the locked house. And most people's response to that is to knock on every door, jiggle every handle, peer through every window, which just makes the person inside lock things up even tighter. But what if instead you sat on the porch, not demanding to be let in, not threatening to leave if the door doesn't open, just sitting there, being calm, being present, being fully yourself, doing your own thing, not making the locked door the entire focus of your life. And over time, because you're not threatening, because you're not demanding, because you're just there and you're real and you're safe, a window opens, just a crack, and you don't rush toward it, you don't try to climb through it, you just notice it and you smile, and a little more light gets in. And then maybe a door opens, just slightly, and still you don't rush, because you understand that the opening took time and trust and had nothing to do with how hard you knocked. It had everything to do with how safe you made the space feel. That's the work. That's what creates real, lasting change in an avoidant relationship. Not the grand gestures, not the ultimatums, not the emotional conversations at 2 a.m. when everyone's defenses are down. The steady, consistent, grounded presence of someone who doesn't need the wall to come down in order to be okay, who is genuinely at peace with themselves and their life, and who is willing to give this person the time and the space to find their own way to the door. Now I want to talk about something slightly different, and that's the role of your own healing in all of this, because I've talked a lot about what to do and not do with your avoidant partner, but there's something underneath all of that which is more important, which is the question of why you're here, why you've chosen this person, why this dynamic feels familiar. Because for a lot of people who end up in relationships with avoidance, there's a reason this particular pattern feels like home. And that reason usually has its roots in something much earlier than this relationship. Maybe you grew up with a parent who was emotionally unpredictable, who was warm sometimes and distant other times. And so you learned that love was something you had to earn, something you had to work for, something that required constant vigilance and effort to maintain. And when you meet someone who recreates that dynamic, someone who is sometimes close and sometimes distant, who needs to be won over and then retreats, it doesn't feel painful. It feels familiar. And familiar, no matter how painful it actually is, feels like love. Because it's what you were taught love looks like. And if that's true for you, then the work isn't just about understanding your avoidant partner. The work is about understanding yourself. Understanding why you keep returning to someone who can't quite meet you, understanding what that pattern is protecting you from, understanding what it would mean to have a relationship that was easy, that was consistent, that didn't require you to be constantly managing, constantly proving, constantly trying to close a distance that keeps reopening. Because for some people, the idea of that kind of relationship is actually more terrifying than the painful cycle they're in. Because at least the painful cycle is known, and the unknown can feel scarier than even the most heartbreaking familiar. So I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to actually sit with it rather than just reading it and moving on. What would your life look like if you stopped trying to unlock someone who hasn't decided to open the door themselves? What would your life feel like if you redirected even a fraction of the energy you've put into this person back into yourself, into your own healing, into your own life, into building things that matter to you, into being the kind of person you'd want to meet if you were dating yourself? Because here's what I know, the healthier you become, the more whole you are, the more genuinely at peace you are with yourself and your life, the less you will tolerate dynamics that drain you, and the more naturally you will attract people who are capable of actually meeting you. And yes, that might mean some hard decisions about the situation you're in right now. It might mean having an honest conversation with yourself about whether what you're hoping for is actually possible with this specific person. Not in theory, not in their best moments, but consistently, realistically, day after day. Because hope is beautiful, but hope that keeps you in a cycle of pain and low returns is not serving you. And you deserve to be honest with yourself about that. Let me bring this back to the practical, because I never want to leave you with just insight without also giving you something you can actually do. So here are some specific things that genuinely create safety for an avoidant, things that are grounded in both psychology and real human experience. First, be someone who doesn't weaponize vulnerability. What that means is if they share something with you, you don't bring it up later in an argument. You don't use it against them. You don't make them regret opening up. Every time an avoidant opens up and gets hurt for it, the wall gets higher. But every time they open up and are met with respect and safety, trust gets built. Second, stop rewarding their distance with more pursuit, not as a game, but because chasing them literally reinforces the cycle. When you pursue, they retreat. When you stop pursuing, they often return. Not always, but often enough that it's worth noticing. And when they return, you don't punish them for having retreated. You welcome them warmly, because punishing their return teaches them that coming back has a cost, and that keeps them from coming back. Third, have the honest conversation about what you need. Not as an ultimatum, not in a moment of high emotion, but calmly, clearly, lovingly. Something like, I know connection can feel hard sometimes, and I really value what we have. I also know that I need to feel close to you to feel good in this relationship. I'm not asking you to be different. I just want us to be honest about what we both need and whether we can find a way to meet in the middle. That kind of conversation, delivered without panic or aggression, opens a door because it shows them you're not trying to control them, you're trying to understand them, and that feels very different. Fourth, and this is the one most people skip, take care of yourself first, not as a strategy, not to make them jealous, but because you genuinely matter, because your joy, your peace, your growth, your life, these things are not negotiable. They are not things you put on hold while you try to solve the puzzle of another person. They are the foundation from which everything else in your life, including your relationships, gets built. And when you are genuinely thriving, when you are pursuing things that matter to you, when you are surrounded by people who love you and see you fully, you show up in your relationship differently. You stop being desperate. You stop being anxious. You stop making the relationship the only thing that matters. And that energy shift, that genuine self-sufficiency, is more attractive and more safety creating for an avoidant than any amount of effort you could pour into trying to please them.